All right, welcome to Module 16. My goal with this really mini lecture is to give you some of the background information on the Gilded Age from 1870 to 1890 that's going to help you understand your role with your group in the Homestead Strike. Now, this is a mini lecture version of information that you're going to get more fully in the textbook. You can also download in Module 16 my full Module 16 PowerPoint. Doesn't have me talking, but you can download it, open the notes, get a lot of my notes on this. So this is just a mini version of some of the things that I want you to think about as you move into that homestead activity. Now, America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890, is called the Gilded Age. It's one of the few time periods in American history where the name that we refer to it by is actually a criticism. The Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain. And if you think about it, or if you want to look up what gilded means, to gild something means to take something essentially worthless and cover it in gold. It's gilded. It has a thin layer of gold on the outside. So it looks beautiful. But on the inside, it could be rotten wood. Mark Twain is criticizing the Gilded Age. Now, I'll tell you what, in the Gilded Age, that layer of gold was very thick. Enormous wealth grows in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. But what Mark Twain was criticizing is underneath that gild, there was a rotten center. So the Gilded Age is marked by both a growth in the economy, the gross national product, a growth in wealth, but also, and if you want to look at some wealth, here's Carnegie's new in Manhattan home. Look at that mansion. And this enormous wealth, which was assisted by a total lack of income tax or corporate income tax, this enormous wealth of the Gilded Age goes side and side, or goes hand in hand with a growing, deepening inequality. So if you're in Manhattan visiting Carnegie's home, don't think it's there anymore, you can walk just about a mile or less south to the Lower East Side, where immigrant workers were living in absolute poverty. So this Gilded Age is marked by that growing inequality. This, of course, is a picture of a Lower East Side tenement. This picture was taken by Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, and his book, How the Other Half Lives, in the 1890s was meant to expose this inequality. So he was a photographer of the 1890s attempting to reform this. And what creates that gulf is new forms of labor. So in our last module, we talked about land being the source for economic independence for freed people. They understood freedom as being linked with economic independence, which for them was land. And across the 19th century, land was the way to be independent. Own land or own your own shop as a master artisan. That avenue of master artisans is closing. And in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and throughout the 20th century, we're going to see primarily working men in these early 80s and 90s. We're going to talk about working women in a couple of weeks, losing their sense of economic independence, which for them meant owning your own labor and skills. That is, before the mid-19th century, they owned their labor, they owned their skills. If you wanted something from them, they set the price. That is changing in the Second Industrial Revolution to wage work. And because they can see that the industrialists, the owners of the factory, are growing enormously wealthy while they're not, the Gilded Age is also marked as a time of enormous labor strikes and labor unrest. Here we have a flyer for a mass meeting in Chicago. We're going to talk about this, the Haymarket Affair. But notice that this flyer is both in English and German. A lot of these workers, and some of you who are playing unskilled workers in the activity, are immigrants. So we're going to talk briefly about the Second Industrial Revolution. We're not going to talk in this little lecture about the transformation of the West. We're going to focus on labor. Then I'm actually going to have another even minier lecture at the end of the module to tell you what happens with the Homestead strike. But I have to do that after you guys decide whether or not you're going to strike together. As we talked about, the second industrial revolution is marked by heavy industrial labor. And this goes along with a demographic shift from farm to factory. Now, in this time period, if you look at the textbook, you're going to see that American homesteads, mostly white homesteaders, are growing in the West as Indian land is being seized, as land that was formerly Mexico is seized. And yet, even with that growth, what we see in the Gilded Age is a shift of workers, primarily that America was an agricultural society, into an industrial. And here's just some of those indication that even as land or number of farms has grown from 408 million acres to 956 million acres in this time period, the percentage of people working in agriculture has halved. Now, these numbers only make sense with a constant influx of immigrants. These are what's called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe primarily. That's how these numbers make sense. So even as acreage of land is growing, the percentage of the workforce working on farms is shrinking, and that's shifting to industrial labor. Do you remember in Module 15 in your reading, The Promised Land, when seized land, millions of acres of seized land seized from Native Americans and Mexico were gifted to the railroads? And that Promised Land reading made an argument that that was essentially land redistribution. Okay. That was an enormous boon to railroad companies, which are powerful and wealthy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. 18, that is. The railroad network by 1880 has entirely united the country. You can go from New York to LA in less than a week. And these railroad train stations, I should say, look at how the wealth that they're displaying. These train stations, when I ask students, show students this picture and say, what does it look like? And I'll ask you, what does it look like? I'll bet most of you thought to yourselves, that looks like a church or a mosque or some sort of house of worship, right? It's a train station. It's huge. It's opulent. It's optimistic that these trains are bringing about the future. And the trains themselves, I'm acting like the trains themselves are doing it. This isn't Thomas the Tank Engine, of course. This is being driven by, we could say, captains of industry. If we wanted to be critical, we could say robber barons, which was a very critical term for them, suggesting that these industrialists were stealing. Let's talk about three of them. I want to tell you about Andrew Carnegie. He is the owner of the Homestead Steelworks that you'll be striking maybe at, and Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick is his partner, and during the strike, he is the one that striking workers actually have to contend with. What's the cover of this amazing book? Well, Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick had a tumultuous friendship. They eventually had a falling out. At the end of his life, Carnegie sent Henry Clay Frick a note asking to meet with him. He wanted to die with their friendship intact. And Henry Clay Frick sent a note back that said, I will meet you in hell. Okay, so a tumultuous relationship between those two friends. But that's not exactly what I want you to know about them. I want you to know that Andrew Carnegie became one of the wealthiest men in America through the Homestead Steelworks. And he became wealthy through something called vertical integration. Let's talk about vertical integration and horizontal. Real fast, what I want you to know. Vertical integration, Andrew Carnegie bought up every level of industry needed for steel production, which meant Andrew Carnegie owned the mines, which meant that Andrew Carnegie owned the steelworks. And Andrew Carnegie owned the trains that moved things to and from the steelworks. That is, every part of the process to getting to a finished product, Carnegie owned. That's vertical integration. Now, John D. Rockefeller became enormously wealthy with his Standard Oil Company through horizontal integration. What does that mean? That means he bought up all of the other oil companies. Usually my students say, isn't that a monopoly? Yes, the progressives are going to be very worried about these monopolies. And I said, there was no income tax. Get a drink of water. There was no corporate income tax, no personal income tax. This is Frick's home. These men became powerful and enormously wealthy. And even though Carnegie, the owner of the steelworks, he believed that wealthy people had a moral imperative to share their wealth. He also believed that wealthy people should be taxed on their income. He was very philanthropic. He started a lot of museums, everything in Pittsburgh. Homestead is right outside of Pittsburgh, I didn't tell you that. Everything in Pittsburgh is named after Carnegie. He started libraries, of course, Carnegie Music Hall in New York. But even though Carnegie himself believed that wealthy people had a moral imperative to share some of that wealth, which he did, he was also a dictator in his homestead factories. He did not believe in workers' rights. So we'll talk about that, or you'll think about that as you decide whether or not to go on strike. You'll think about the working conditions that your roll sheet lays out for you. And those hours, those low wages are what it took to build the kind of wealth that you're looking at here in this screen. Oh, here's some weird maps. Here's a cartoon from 1907. You may have seen it in high school in your history class, depicting Rockefeller's, that horizontal immigration that looks a lot like a monopoly, depicts the Standard Oil Company as an octopus. It's already crushed all of its competitors. It's already has its, what do you call it, suckers grappled around the Supreme Court, grappled around Congress, and it's heading for the White House next, talking about the corruption, the very close relationship during the Gilded Age between Republican Party and politicians with industrialists to work against essentially workers' rights. All right. So your roll sheet, here's a picture of some of the men who worked at Homestead. So as you're thinking about your roll, this is what you might have looked like. Yes, they are all white. They are different varieties of white. You'll notice that there's some tension between native-born and Hungarian, Eastern European immigrants in your roll sheets. So you might look at them and be like, oh, they're all white guys. They viewed themselves as quite a mix, and there was some real divisions and tensions there in Homestead. When we're talking about workers, of course, today in this module in our activity, we're focusing on industrial work, heavy industrial work, which tended to be done by men. But we also want to understand when we say workers in the Gilded Age, we also mean women and children, a lot of children working in the Gilded Age. And this is just another image of one of those tenements that we looked at earlier. I'm going to skip this because I want to get to this. There's a couple of events that really are some of the context you need for Homestead. I talked about this being an era of enormous labor upheaval. So I'm going to tell you about two strikes or two incidents that happened before Homestead. So all of this stuff is before Homestead. The first thing that I want to talk about is the 1877 railroad strike. Railroad workers in West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Chicago, they shut down the railroad companies. And think about that. They went on strike. It's not just the railroad companies that were losing out. Every industrial factory, every, you think about beef coming up from San Antonio into Chicago, that was shut down. And they went on strike, and it ended in violence. Dozens of people were killed. Strikers took over the city of Chicago and Pittsburgh for a couple of hours. This is actually the ruins of a railroad roundhouse in Pittsburgh. And you're looking at it and you might be thinking, this looks like a war zone. When we talk about labor unrest in the Gilded Age, when I talk about the Battle of Homestead, that's not me being extra. It was a battle. This was this image that we're seeing here in 1877. The federal government, I talked about that close tie between Republican politicians and industry. The federal government sent in federal troops to essentially battle against workers. And this image that you're seeing here is one of the results. People don't want another 1877 railroad strike, right? And think about that. When you're going on strike, how are people going to react to another big strike? Are they going to be afraid that this is going to happen again? And there were other incidents like the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair in the 1880s, and I can't believe this, I'm blanking on the date. Look it up. I didn't forget the date. I'm sending you an assignment here. Look up the date for the Haymarket Affair. Okay, you've come back now. You know the date. This was in Chicago when striking workers tussled with police. 2 workers were killed. The next day, there was a mass meeting in Haymarket Square in Chicago to figure out what should we do about these workers that have been killed. And during that meeting, someone, we don't know who, someone threw a bomb. Several policemen were killed. 8 anarchists. Chicago was a hotbed of not just labor activity, but anarchy, communism, socialism. A lot of really far left or political movements were happening in Chicago. So 8 anarchists who probably didn't throw the bomb, we have no evidence that they did, were arrested. 4 of them were hanged. 1 committed suicide. The last 3 were ultimately released because there was genuinely no evidence against them. But what the Haymarket Affair does is it creates an association between labor. These men, like the Knights of Labor, the biggest union in the 80s was the Knights of Labor. It united skilled workers, unskilled workers, and you're going to think about why there would be a distinction between those two in the first place. It united all those skilled and unskilled workers. It united white workers and African American. Now, they were all men, but they're working on uniting all of these different types of labor. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk about a labor union that brought in women too. So the Knights of Labor, here you see them on parade, depicting themselves as very respectable. Look at their little top hats. And they're associating their treatment with slavery from the past. They're saying, hey, didn't we just end that? What are we doing now? These respectable men who are trying to convince people that labor deserves some of their needs met, deserves to have a seat at the table. The Haymarket Affair associates labor with anarchists, associates labor with violence. That's something that you have to grapple with too as striking workers. If you strike, now Carnegie's left, Andrew Carnegie's gone to Scotland, he's left Frick in charge. Frick rules with an iron fist. If you go on strike, is there going to be violence? I just gave you a spoiler. Pretend you didn't see that slide. To recap, I want you to take away that the Gilded Age is a time of enormous growth of wealth, gross national product, growth of the economy, and enormous inequality. And particularly this week, we're talking about men are losing some of the labor rights that they expected to have. They're losing the right to own their own labor. They're being pushed into wage work. They're losing their knowledge and skills. They're being divided into skilled and unskilled categories. And they're trying to, like I said, get a seat at the table. They're trying to have their needs met. Read up on your homestead strike. Read up on your role. Talk with your group. Figure out if you're going to strike and how. And then I'm going to come back with like a 5-minute video at the end of the module telling you what happened next. All right. Thanks as always for listening. And